She accidentally fell asleep on the Duke's shoulder in the carriage, and his ruthless decision changed her fate forever. The rhythmic sway of the carriage had been Eloan Fairchild's undoing. One moment she had been sitting perfectly upright, hands folded in her lap like the governess had taught her years ago, and the next she was awakening to the disturbing sensation of wool beneath her cheek and the scent of cedar filling her nostrils. The realization struck her like cold water. She had fallen asleep on a stranger's shoulder. Eloan jerked upright so quickly that her gloved hands caught in the velvet cushions, her heart hammering against her ribs as mortification flooded through her. The day had been impossibly long. The interview at the Pemberton house had stretched past tea time, the subsequent walk through London's maze-like streets had left her feet aching, and the relief of finally securing passage home had apparently lulled her into this catastrophic lapse of propriety. "I beg your pardon," she whispered, the words catching in her throat as she pressed herself against the far corner of the seat. "I am so terribly sorry, I didn't mean." The man beside her hadn't moved. Not to accommodate her sudden weight against him, not to wake her, not even now to acknowledge her stammered apology. He sat with the same rigid posture he'd maintained when she'd first climbed into the carriage, as if he'd simply chosen to allow her mistake rather than prevent it. London passed in amber-lit windows beyond the glass, the late afternoon casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Inside the carriage, silence stretched between them like an accusation. Eloan's gaze darted toward the man's profile, sharp jaw, dark hair meticulously arranged, clothes that spoke of wealth without ostentation. Everything about him suggested control, precision, the kind of authority that made her acutely aware of her own shabby gloves and the small tear in her dress's sleeve that she'd hoped no one would notice. "Where is Mr. Dargan?" she asked, confusion threading through her embarrassment. Miles Dargan had been the one to offer her passage, had promised nothing more than a simple ride to her brother's lodgings. She had never seen this man before in her life. The stranger's head turned then, and Eloan found herself looking into eyes of such pale blue they seemed almost silver in the dim light. When he spoke, his voice carried the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Are you apologizing for falling asleep?" he asked, "or for using a complete stranger as your pillow?" The question cut through her stammered explanations like a blade through silk. There was no warmth in it, no attempt to ease her embarrassment, but neither was there cruelty. Simply a cool assessment that left her feeling exposed and somehow found wanting. "Both, I suppose," Eloan managed, lifting her chin despite the heat burning in her cheeks. "Though I fail to see how my exhaustion became your burden to bear." Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but perhaps the faintest recognition of her refusal to crumble entirely under his scrutiny. "How unfortunate that you should find yourself so thoroughly compromised," he said, and there was something in his tone that made her stomach tighten with unease. "And in such public view." Only then did Eloan notice they were slowing, the steady clatter of wheels on cobblestones beginning to fade. Through the window she could see the imposing facades of London's finest residential square, windows glowing with warm light, liveried servants moving with practiced efficiency between grand carriages. This was not her neighborhood. This was not her world. The carriage drew to a halt before a townhouse that seemed to stretch endlessly upward, its windows catching the last rays of sunlight like jewels. Even before the door opened, Eloan could see movement, servants appearing as if summoned by invisible signals, their attention focused entirely on the man beside her. "Your Grace," came a woman's voice from outside, respectful and warm. "Your Grace." The title hit Eloan like a physical blow. She had fallen asleep on a duke's shoulder. A duke. Heat crawled up her throat as the full scope of her situation became clear, not just the impropriety, but the impossible social chasm she had somehow stumbled across in her exhaustion. The Duke stepped down first, then turned to offer his hand. Eloan stared at it for a moment, knowing that everything would change the moment she accepted his assistance. But the alternative, remaining in the carriage like a stubborn child, seemed infinitely worse. His hand was steady beneath hers as she stepped down onto the pavement, and she was dimly aware of faces in windows, of whispered conversations suddenly stilling, of a world that had been watching and was now, quietly, taking note. The entrance hall of what she now understood to be Carrington House stretched before Eloan like a cathedral of marble and gilt. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors gazed down from their gilded frames, their eyes seeming to follow her uncertain steps across floors polished to mirror brightness. Every surface whispered of generations of wealth, of bloodlines that could trace themselves back through centuries of power and privilege. She did not belong here. The knowledge sat in her chest like a stone. "Adrian, you've returned." The voice that rang out across the vast space belonged to a young woman who seemed to materialize from one of the shadowed doorways. She was perhaps 20, with the same pale eyes as the Duke but animated by a warmth that transformed her entire countenance. "And you've brought, oh my." The woman's gaze fixed on Eloan with undisguised curiosity, taking in her simple dress, her practical boots, the way she stood frozen just inside the doorway as if afraid to venture further into such grandeur. "Miss Fairchild," the Duke said, his voice carrying the same measured tone he had used in the carriage. "My sister, Lady Seraphina Ashbourne." Seraphina's eyes lit with something that looked almost like delight. "Miss Fairchild? The Miss Fairchild who fell asleep on my brother's shoulder? Oh, this is delicious. The entire city will be talking about this by morning." Eloan felt the blood drain from her face. "I beg your pardon?" "You were seen, my dear," Seraphina continued, seemingly oblivious to Eloan's growing horror. "Mrs. Pemberton's cook happened to be at the market when you climbed into Adrian's carriage looking thoroughly exhausted, and then the Weatherby's coachman passed you on Grosvenor Street just as you were, well, using my brother as furniture. Word travels faster than carriages in this part of London." The Duke moved with deliberate calm to a side table where crystal decanters caught the light from the chandelier overhead. He poured himself a measure of amber liquid and took a sip before speaking. "The situation," he said, "requires careful handling." Eloan found her voice at last, though it emerged smaller than she would have liked. "What situation?" "I simply fell asleep." "Surely that's hardly worth." "You fell asleep on an unmarried duke," Seraphina interrupted, her tone gentle but firm. "In his private carriage. After being seen entering it without a chaperone. In our world, Miss Fairchild, appearances are everything, and yours has just become rather complicated." The words hit Eloan like successive blows. She thought of her brother Rowan, of the modest lodgings they shared, of the careful reputation she had built through years of governess work and private lessons. All of it now tainted by one moment of exhausted weakness. "I should leave," she said, taking a step toward the door. "Immediately. Before this becomes any worse than it already is." "I'm afraid," the Duke said quietly, "it's rather too late for that." He set down his glass and turned to face her fully. In the golden light of the entrance hall, she could see him clearly for the first time, the sharp angles of his face, the slight lines around his eyes that spoke of burdens carried privately, the way he held himself as if bearing invisible weight. "If you leave now," he continued, "you leave as the woman who compromised herself with the Duke of Carrington and then fled in shame. The story will follow you wherever you go, to whatever position you next seek. In this city, reputation is currency, and yours has just become devalued." Eloan's hands clenched at her sides. "And if I stay?" "If you stay, we control the narrative." His pale eyes met hers directly. "We give society exactly what it expects to see, a courtship properly managed and appropriately concluded." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Eloan could feel Seraphina watching this exchange with bright interest, but her attention remained fixed on the Duke's face, searching for some indication of his true intentions. "A false courtship," she said carefully. "A necessary arrangement." He moved closer, not close enough to intimidate, but near enough that she could see the flecks of darker blue in his pale iris. "I have my own reasons for requiring such a distraction. You need protection from the consequences of this afternoon's events. We can serve each other's purposes. For how long? Until the season ends. Until society finds something else to occupy its attention. Until we both have what we need." Eloan studied his face, this stranger who spoke of arrangements and necessities as if they were discussing the weather. There was something almost clinical in his approach, as if he had already calculated every variable and found their situation perfectly manageable. "And what is it that you need, Your Grace?" she asked quietly. For the first time since she had awakened on his shoulder, something flickered across his expression, too quick to interpret, but real enough to remind her that beneath all that control was a man with his own complications. "Freedom from expectations," he said finally. "Time to make my own choices without interference." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. Whatever game he was proposing, it seemed he intended to play it with at least partial truth. Eloan looked around the magnificent entrance hall, at the portraits and the marble and the crystalline perfection of a world she had only ever observed from the outside. Then she looked back at the Duke, at this man who somehow needed her as much as she found herself needing him. "Very well," she said. "But I have conditions." The morning light that filtered through the tall windows of Carrington House seemed different from any sunlight Eloan had ever known. It fell across Persian carpets and mahogany furniture with a quality that spoke of privilege, of rooms that had never known want or uncertainty. She stood at the window of the guest chamber she had been given, watching the perfectly manicured garden below, and tried to reconcile this palatial reality with the modest boarding house room she had left behind. Her conditions had been accepted with surprising ease. The Duke, Adrian, as she was now expected to call him, had listened to each of her requirements with the same measured attention he might give to a business contract. Her family would be informed with dignity and discretion. She would receive references upon the arrangement's conclusion that would secure her future employment. And the moment he chose to pursue a genuine courtship with another woman, she would be free to leave without scandal or obligation. What she hadn't anticipated was how thoroughly she would be absorbed into this alien world. "Miss Fairchild?" A soft knock at her door interrupted her contemplation. "Her Grace requests your presence in the morning room." Her Grace. Eloan's stomach tightened as she smoothed her skirts. One of 3 dresses Serafina had insisted upon having altered for her overnight, claiming that her own wardrobe, while perfectly respectable, would not survive the scrutiny they were certain to face. The morning room proved to be a symphony in pale yellow and cream, with windows that overlooked the square and furniture arranged to encourage intimate conversation. Seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace was a woman whose presence seemed to command the very air around her. Marigold Ashbourne, the Dowager Duchess of Carrington, was perhaps 70, with silver hair arranged in perfect waves and eyes the same pale blue as her grandson's, though hers held decades of accumulated knowledge and, Eloan suspected, very little patience for foolishness. "Miss Fairchild." The dowager's voice carried the crisp authority of someone who had spent a lifetime being obeyed without question. "Please sit." Eloan lowered herself into the chair opposite, acutely aware of being evaluated by someone whose judgment could make or break reputations with a single word. "I understand," the dowager continued, "that you have entered into an arrangement with my grandson." "Yes, Your Grace." "And that this arrangement stems from your unfortunate display of impropriety yesterday afternoon." Heat crept up Eloan's neck, but she kept her voice steady. "I fell asleep, Your Grace. Nothing more scandalous than that." To her surprise, the dowager's mouth curved into what might have been the ghost of a smile. "Nothing more scandalous than compromising yourself with one of the most eligible bachelors in England, you mean? My dear girl, in our world, falling asleep on a man's shoulder might as well be a declaration of intent. It was an accident." "Of course it was." The dowager lifted her teacup with practiced grace. "But accidents, Miss Fairchild, can become opportunities if handled with sufficient intelligence. The question is whether you possess that intelligence." Eloan straightened in her chair. "I believe I do, Your Grace." "We shall see." The older woman's gaze sharpened. "Tell me, what do you know of my grandson?" The question caught Eloan off guard. "Very little, Your Grace. We only met yesterday." "Then allow me to enlighten you." The dowager set down her cup with deliberate precision. "Adrian has been the Duke of Carrington since he was 23 years old. His father died in a riding accident, his mother followed 2 years later from what the physicians called a weak heart but which I know was grief. He has spent the last 8 years managing estates, investments, and responsibilities that would have crushed lesser men." Eloan listened, beginning to understand that this was not merely family history but a warning. "He is," the dowager continued, "a man who has learned to survive by controlling every variable in his environment. Emotion is a luxury he cannot afford, vulnerability a weakness he cannot risk. Do you understand what I am telling you? You're warning me not to mistake this arrangement for something it is not." "I am warning you," the dowager said sharply, "not to mistake yourself for someone capable of changing him. Adrian has buried his heart so deeply that I sometimes wonder if it still beats. This arrangement of yours may serve both your purposes admirably, but do not make the error of believing it will transform either of you." The words stung more than Eloan cared to admit. "I have no such illusions, Your Grace." "Good." The dowager's expression softened fractionally. "Because despite what you may think, Miss Fairchild, I do not disapprove of you. Your background is modest, your connections limited, but you possess something many young women of our circle lack." "Which is?" "Dignity under pressure. You did not weep or faint when Adrian explained your situation yesterday. You did not beg or attempt to manipulate him with feminine wiles. You negotiated. That suggests a strength of character that I find promising." Eloan felt a strange warmth at the unexpected praise, even as she wondered what the dowager hoped to accomplish with this conversation. "However," the older woman continued, "I must make one thing perfectly clear. If you develop feelings for my grandson, and I warn you now that it would be both foolish and futile. You must not allow those feelings to cloud your judgment. Adrian requires protection from emotional entanglements, not encouragement toward them. I understand, Your Grace. I wonder if you do. The dowager rose, her movements still graceful despite her years. You see, Miss Fairchild, the last woman who thought she could reach my grandson's heart was his mother. And her attempts at warmth and connection, her refusal to accept the limitations of duty and circumstance, ultimately destroyed her. The warning hung in the air between them as the dowager moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused and looked back. Enjoy this arrangement for what it is, my dear. But do not mistake theater for reality. That way lies only heartbreak. The ballroom at Pembroke House blazed with 1,000 candles, their light caught and multiplied by crystal chandeliers that seemed to hover like frozen stars above the assembled crowd. Eloan stood at the edge of the dance floor, her borrowed silk gown, a creation of Seraphina's in deep emerald that transformed her modest figure into something almost elegant, feeling like costume armor against the curious stares that followed her every movement. 3 days had passed since her conversation with the Dowager Duchess, 3 days of careful preparation for this moment. Seraphina had coached her on the intricate social hierarchies that govern such gatherings, on which families held real power and which merely held titles, on how to navigate conversations that said everything while appearing to say nothing at all. But no amount of preparation had readied her for the reality of being scrutinized by London's elite as the woman who had somehow captured the Duke of Carrington's attention. "You're doing beautifully," Seraphina murmured at her elbow, her own gown of pale blue silk making her seem to glow in the candlelight. "Half the room is consumed with curiosity, and the other half is green with envy." "I feel like a specimen under glass," Eloan replied quietly, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing footman more for something to do with her hands than from any desire to drink. "That feeling never entirely goes away," Seraphina admitted with a conspiratorial smile. "The trick is to remember that they need the entertainment more than you need their approval." Across the room, Adrian moved through the crowd with the effortless authority that seemed to be his birthright. He paused to speak with Lord Pembroke, nodded acknowledgement to a group of gentlemen near the card room, accepted the curtsy of a young woman whose mother beamed with transparent hope. To all appearances, he was simply fulfilling his social obligations with his usual measured politeness. But Eloan had begun to notice the subtle signs of his discomfort, the slight tension in his shoulders, the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the manner in which he seemed to position himself always near an exit. Whatever freedom he sought through their arrangement, it was clear that events like this represented everything he wished to escape. "Miss Fairchild." The voice that interrupted her observations belonged to a woman whose beauty was as sharp and perfectly arranged as a blade. Lady Cordelia Wexford approached with the fluid grace of someone who had been trained from birth to command attention. Her golden hair swept into an elaborate arrangement that showcased jewels worth more than Eloan had earned in years. "Lady Cordelia," Eloan replied, offering a careful curtsy. She had been warned about Cordelia Wexford, the woman widely expected to become the next Duchess of Carrington, whose family connections and substantial dowry made her an ideal match for a man of Adrian's position. "How refreshing to meet you at last," Cordelia continued, her tone carrying the particular warmth that aristocratic women employed when delivering their most cutting observations. "The entire city has been simply fascinated by your unique introduction to our circle." "Your Grace has been very kind," Eloan replied carefully. "Oh, Adrian is always kind. It's one of his most admirable qualities." Cordelia's smile remained perfectly in place as her eyes grew cold. "Though I confess myself curious about your background, Miss Fairchild. Your family name is not familiar to me." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, conversations continued, but Eloan could sense the subtle shift in attention, the way nearby guests strained to hear her response without appearing to eavesdrop. "My family has no particular claim to fame, Lady Cordelia. We are quite ordinary people." "How wonderfully honest of you to admit it." Cordelia's laugh sounded like silver bells, beautiful and somehow cutting. "It must be rather overwhelming to find yourself in such elevated circumstances. I do hope you won't find the adjustment too difficult." Before Eloan could respond, she felt a familiar presence at her shoulder. Adrian materialized beside her with the silent grace that seemed characteristic of him, his hand coming to rest lightly at the small of her back in a gesture that appeared both protective and possessive. "Cordelia," he said, inclining his head in polite acknowledgement. "I see you've met Miss Fairchild." "Indeed. We were just discussing her fascinating background." Cordelia's gaze moved between them with calculating interest. "You must tell me, Adrian, however did you discover such a treasure?" It's not as if your paths would naturally cross. Adrian's hand pressed slightly more firmly against Eloan's back, a reminder of their agreement and perhaps a warning to let him handle the interrogation. Miss Fairchild and I were introduced through mutual acquaintances, he replied with the same measured tone he used for all social necessities. I found her company unexpectedly engaging. How romantic. Cordelia's smile remained fixed, but something flickered in her expression that made Eloan's skin prickle with unease. Though I confess I worry about dear Miss Fairchild navigating our rather complex social expectations. It would be such a pity if misunderstandings arose from inexperience. The threat was delicately delivered but unmistakable. Eloan felt Adrian's tension increase, though his expression remained perfectly controlled. Miss Fairchild, he said quietly, would you care to dance? It was escape disguised as invitation, and Eloan accepted it gratefully. But as Adrian led her onto the dance floor, as his hand settled at her waist and hers found its place on his shoulder, she could not shake the feeling that Lady Cordelia Wexford had just drawn first blood in a war Eloan had not known she was fighting. The waltz began and Adrian guided her through the steps with practiced ease. For a moment, surrounded by music and movement, it was possible to forget the watching eyes and whispered speculation. But then the dance ended, and reality returned with the polite applause that seemed to carry undercurrents of judgment. Well managed, Adrian murmured as he escorted her from the floor. Though I suspect this is only the beginning. Eloan glanced back toward where Lady Cordelia stood surrounded by a circle of admirers, her golden head bent as she spoke in animated tones that set her audience laughing. Indeed, she replied quietly. I rather think you're right. The library at Carrington House had become Eloan's refuge. In the week following the Pembroke Ball, she had discovered that the vast collection of books offered not only solace but also a kind of invisibility. Servants moved quietly through the space, tending the fire and dusting shelves, but otherwise left her undisturbed among the leather-bound volumes and comfortable reading chairs. It was here that Adrian found her on a gray Thursday afternoon, rain pattering against the tall windows as she sat curled in a chair near the fireplace, a copy of Sense and Sensibility open in her lap. You've been avoiding the drawing room, he observed, settling into the chair opposite hers with the careful grace she had come to recognize as his habitual manner of occupying space, present but prepared to withdraw at any moment. I've been reading, Eloan replied, though they both knew it was only a partial truth. The drawing room had become a stage where she was expected to perform her role as his intended, receiving callers and managing conversations that felt like elaborate tests she wasn't sure she was passing. Serafina is concerned that you're not enjoying your introduction to society. Eloan closed the book and studied his face in the firelight. He looked tired, she realized, in a way that went deeper than mere physical exhaustion. The kind of weariness that came from carrying burdens that never lessened, only shifted from one shoulder to the other. Are you enjoying it? She asked quietly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He was silent for a long moment, his pale eyes fixed on the flames dancing in the grate. Enjoyment has never been particularly relevant to my circumstances, he said finally. There are obligations to fulfill, expectations to meet. Personal preference is a luxury I surrendered long ago. That sounds like a very lonely way to live. Lonely? He repeated the word as if testing its weight. Perhaps. But also predictable. Safe. There is comfort in knowing exactly what is expected of you. Eloan set the book aside and leaned forward slightly. Is that why you need this arrangement? To avoid the expectations surrounding Lady Cordelia? Adrian's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. My grandmother has made her preferences quite clear regarding my future duchess. Lady Cordelia possesses all the qualities required for the position: breeding, connections, dowry, social grace. She would be an exemplary choice. But you don't want to marry her. Want? Another word he seemed to find foreign. What I want is irrelevant. What matters is what would serve the dukedom best. And yet here we are, engaged in elaborate subterfuge to avoid that very outcome. For the first time since she had known him, Adrian smiled, not the polite social expression he wore in public, but something real and slightly rueful that transformed his entire countenance. Here we are indeed, he agreed. Though I suspect you find my motivations cowardly. I find them human, Eloan said softly. You've spent years fulfilling everyone else's expectations. Perhaps it's time you considered your own. Something shifted in his expression, a crack appearing in the careful composure he maintained so religiously. And what would you have me consider, Miss Fairchild? What you actually want from life. Not what duty demands or tradition expects, but what would make you content. Content. He spoke the word like a foreign language. I'm not certain I remember what that feels like. The admission hung between them in the quiet library, more intimate than anything they had shared in their carefully orchestrated public performances. Eloan felt something tighten in her chest, a dangerous flutter of genuine concern for this man who seemed to have forgotten how to want anything for himself. Perhaps, she said carefully, that's something you could learn to remember. Adrian's gaze met hers across the space between their chairs, and for a moment she thought she saw something vulnerable flicker in those pale blue eyes. But then he seemed to collect himself, the familiar mask of control sliding back into place. You're very kind, Miss Fairchild. But I fear you credit me with more capacity for change than I actually possess. Before Eloan could respond, the library door opened and Serafina appeared, her cheeks flushed from the cold and her eyes bright with what looked like barely contained mischief. There you both are, she announced, pulling off her gloves as she approached the fireplace. I've just returned from the most enlightening morning call with Lady Pembroke. It seems our little arrangement is causing quite the stir in certain circles. Adrian straightened in his chair, his attention immediately focused. What kind of stir? The profitable kind, for those brave enough to place wagers. Serafina's grin widened. It appears the gentlemen at White's have opened a book on whether you'll actually marry Miss Fairchild or come to your senses and choose Cordelia Wexford before the season ends. Eloan felt heat climb her throat. They're wagering on our relationship? Oh my dear, they wager on everything. Whether it will rain, which horse will win at Ascot, how many daughters Lord Pemberton's wife will produce. Your romantic prospects are merely the latest entertainment. Serafina settled onto the sofa with evident satisfaction. Though I must say the odds are quite flattering. 3-1 in favor of true love triumphing. And what, Adrian asked dryly, are the odds on scandal and social ruin? Surprisingly low, actually. It seems your reputation for propriety is so well established that most believe you incapable of genuine impropriety, even in matters of the heart. Eloan watched Adrian process this information, noting the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested the betting book troubled him more than he was willing to admit. Well, he said finally, I suppose we should be flattered by society's investment in our affairs. But as the conversation moved on to other topics, Serafina's morning calls, the upcoming assembly at Almack's, the latest political developments, Eloan found herself studying Adrian's profile and wondering what it must be like to have your entire emotional life reduced to entertainment for others, your most private decisions transformed into public sport. No wonder he had learned to guard himself so carefully. No wonder he spoke of want and contentment as foreign concepts. In his world, even love had become a performance for other people's amusement. The revelation came through a conversation Eloan was never meant to overhear. She had been returning from the morning room, where she had spent an hour responding to correspondence, letters from curious acquaintances of her family, invitations that arrived daily now that she bore the protection of Carrington's name, and a particularly warm note from her brother Rowan expressing amazement at her sudden elevation in circumstances. The house was quiet in that particular way of grand residences in the afternoon, with servants moving like ghosts through their duties and family members occupied with their private pursuits. She had paused outside Adrian's study, intending to knock and perhaps continue their conversation from the library the day before, when she heard voices through the partially open door. Adrian's measured tones and another voice she didn't immediately recognize, male, older, carrying the authority of long familiarity. The arrangement is working precisely as intended, the unfamiliar voice was saying. Lady Cordelia's family grows more anxious by the day. Her mother has already inquired twice about your intentions regarding this Fairchild girl. Good, Adrian replied. Let them wonder. The longer the uncertainty continues, the more reasonable my eventual proposal to Cordelia will appear. Eloan felt something cold settle in her stomach. She should leave, should retreat to her room and pretend she had never heard this exchange. But her feet seemed rooted to the marble floor. And the girl herself, the other voice continued. She's not becoming attached? There was a pause that stretched long enough for Eloan to hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Miss Fairchild understands the terms of our agreement, Adrian said finally. She is not a romantic fool, despite her circumstances. She knows this arrangement serves both our purposes and will end when those purposes are fulfilled. Still, she's been seen with you quite frequently. The opera, the Pembroke ball, that afternoon ride in Hyde Park. Society is beginning to believe the attachment genuine. Society believes what it chooses to believe. Miss Fairchild is adequate to the role she plays. Intelligent enough to navigate the social requirements, dignified enough to reflect well on the family name during this temporary association. Adequate. The word hit Eloan like a physical blow. She pressed her hand to the wall, steadying herself as the conversation continued. And when you do propose to Lady Cordelia? How will you manage Miss Fairchild's transition back to her former circumstances? She will be provided with excellent references and sufficient funds to establish herself comfortably. The arrangement was always temporary. She has no expectations beyond what was explicitly promised. Very prudent. Though I confess, Adrian, I sometimes wonder if this elaborate charade is necessary. Lady Cordelia would accept your proposal tomorrow, arrangement or no arrangement. Her family is eager for the connection. Perhaps. Adrian's voice carried that familiar note of control, as if he were discussing estate management rather than marriage. But I prefer to enter such negotiations from a position of strength. Let them believe they are competing for my attention rather than securing an inevitable outcome. Eloan had heard enough. She moved away from the door on silent feet, her mind reeling with the casual cruelty of what she had just learned. Not the arrangement itself, she had always known it was temporary, had negotiated the terms herself with clear eyes and practical expectations. But the dismissive way Adrian spoke of her, the clinical calculation behind every kindness he had shown, the revelation that even his moments of apparent vulnerability had been nothing more than performance. She made it to her room before the tears came, hot and furious and utterly humiliating. She had been such a fool. Despite every warning, despite her own better judgment, she had begun to believe that the quiet conversations in the library meant something. That his careful attention during their public appearances reflected genuine regard rather than mere competence in playing his role. When Serafina knocked an hour later, Eloan had composed herself sufficiently to receive her with something approaching normal equanimity. "There you are," Serafina said, settling herself on the edge of the bed with the easy familiarity they had developed over the past weeks. "Adrian is looking for you. Something about reviewing your schedule for tomorrow's garden party." "I'm certain His Grace can manage my social calendar without my input," Eloan replied, her voice carefully level. "After all, I am merely adequate to the role I play." Serafina's expression sharpened with concern. "Eloan? What's happened?" For a moment, Eloan was tempted to confess everything. The overheard conversation, her own foolish hopes, the way her heart had somehow become entangled despite every reasonable precaution. But what would be the point? Serafina loved her brother, would defend him even if she disapproved of his methods. And ultimately, Adrian had done nothing wrong. He had never promised her anything beyond the terms of their original agreement. "Nothing has happened," she said instead. "I'm simply tired. Perhaps I should decline tomorrow's engagement. Too much society too quickly, I think." Serafina studied her with those pale ashbourne eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Are you certain that's all? You seem—" "I seem adequate," Eloan interrupted with a smile that felt like broken glass. "Which, I'm told, is quite sufficient for current purposes." Something flickered across Serafina's face, understanding, perhaps, or recognition. But she didn't press, merely squeezed Eloan's hand and promised to make her excuses for the evening's dinner. Alone again, Eloan stood at her window and looked out over the perfectly manicured gardens of Carrington House. Tomorrow she would resume her performance, would smile and nod and play the role of Adrian's intended with all the dignity she could muster. But something had changed in that hallway outside his study, some illusion had been stripped away to reveal the mechanical precision of their arrangement. She was adequate. Nothing more, nothing less. And perhaps it was time she remembered that truth and guarded what remained of her heart accordingly. The garden party at Ashford Manor unfolded like a watercolor painting come to life, all dappled sunlight and pastel gowns scattered across emerald lawns. Ladies moved in graceful clusters beneath their parasols while gentlemen engaged in animated discussions near the refreshment tables. It should have been enchanting, and perhaps on any other day, Eloan might have found wonder in the elaborate social ballet playing out around her. Instead, she felt like an actress who had forgotten her lines. She stood beside Adrian near the rose arbor, her gloved hand resting lightly on his arm as they received a steady stream of well-wishers and curious acquaintances. To all outward appearances, they presented the picture of a couple growing comfortable in their attachment. He solicitous of her comfort, she appropriately deferential to his position while maintaining her own quiet dignity. But beneath the performance, everything had changed. Where once she had felt the flutter of genuine connection during their public displays of affection, now she sensed only the mechanical precision of well-rehearsed roles. When Adrian's hand covered hers, she felt the practiced gesture rather than the man. When he smiled down at her during a particularly pointed inquiry about their wedding plans, she saw calculation rather than warmth. "Miss Fairchild appears rather pale today," Lady Pemberton observed during one of their many conversational ambushes. "I do hope she's not finding the season too taxing. Some constitutions are simply not suited to such elevated circumstances." The comment was delivered with the particular smile that aristocratic ladies employed when administering social poison, but Adrian's response was everything propriety demanded. "Miss Fairchild has been managing her introduction to society with remarkable grace," he replied smoothly. "Though I confess I may have been overzealous in accepting invitations on her behalf. A quieter schedule might indeed be wise." It was perfectly said, striking just the right balance of concern and pride. The response of a devoted suitor mindful of his beloved's welfare. Eloan might have been touched by such consideration, if she hadn't known it was merely another calculated performance for their audience. "How thoughtful you are, Your Grace," Lady Pemberton simpered. "Though I'm certain Miss Fairchild appreciates your attention to her needs." The conversation drifted to other topics: the unseasonably fine weather, the upcoming assembly at Almack's, speculation about other romantic attachments forming among the season's eligible participants. Eloan contributed when addressed directly but otherwise found herself studying the crowd with new eyes, seeing the elaborate dance of alliance and ambition that governed every interaction. It was during a brief respite, when Adrian had been drawn away by Lord Ashford to inspect some new addition to the stables, that Lady Cordelia materialized at Eloan's side with the silent grace of a hunting cat. "Miss Fairchild," she said, her voice carrying that particular warmth that had come to mean danger. "How lovely you look today. That shade of blue is quite becoming, though I fear it may be a touch too sophisticated for someone of your background." Eloan turned to face her directly, something reckless stirring in her chest. After yesterday's revelation, Lady Cordelia's veiled insults felt less threatening than tiresome. "Your concern for my sartorial choices is most kind, Lady Cordelia, though I confess myself curious why you should take such interest in my appearance." Cordelia's smile sharpened. "Oh, my dear, I take interest in anything that affects dear Adrian's happiness. We've known each other since childhood, you know. Our families have been close for generations. How fortunate for you both." "Indeed." Cordelia moved closer, her voice dropping to a more intimate register. "Which is why I feel I must speak plainly, woman to woman. You do realize, don't you, that this little romance of yours is nothing more than an elaborate jest?" Eloan felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm not certain what you mean. Come now, Miss Fairchild. Surely you don't believe Adrian could seriously consider marriage to someone so obviously beneath his station? A governess, I'm told, from a family with debts and no connections. It would be social suicide." The words stung precisely because they contained enough truth to wound. But Eloan had spent her life navigating situations where she was unwanted, unwelcome, judged insufficient. She had developed armor against such attacks. "Your Grace's affections are his own to bestow," she said quietly. "I make no claims beyond what he has chosen to offer." Cordelia laughed, the sound like silver bells in the afternoon air. "Oh, my poor dear child. You actually believe he cares for you, don't you? How utterly charming. Though I suppose someone of your inexperience could hardly be expected to recognize the difference between practiced courtesy and genuine regard." Eloan's hands clenched at her sides, but she forced herself to remain calm. "And you believe yourself qualified to make such distinctions?" "I believe myself qualified to recognize a man I've known since we were children. Adrian Ashbourne is many things: dutiful, intelligent, devastatingly handsome, but he is not a romantic fool. He would never jeopardize everything his family has built for centuries for the sake of, what did you call it? Affection?" The cruel accuracy of the assessment hit Eloan like a physical blow. But before she could formulate a response, Cordelia continued with the relentless precision of someone moving for the kill. "Do you know why his mother died, Miss Fairchild? The real reason, not the pretty fiction about weak hearts that the family prefers." Eloan's mouth felt suddenly dry. "Lady Cordelia, I don't think. She died because she was weak. Because she allowed herself to believe that love could triumph over duty, that passion could overcome the obligations of rank. She married beneath herself, you see. Oh, not as dramatically as your situation, but enough to create complications. The stress of never quite belonging, never quite being accepted, ultimately destroyed her." Cordelia's voice carried a note of what might have been genuine sympathy, making her words even more devastating. "Adrian watched it happen. Watched his mother slowly crumble under the weight of expectations she could never meet, watched his father retreat into guilt and duty until there was nothing left of the man who had once defied convention for love. Do you really think he would repeat those mistakes? Do you really think he would risk destroying another woman the same way? The question hung in the air between them as Adrian's voice could be heard approaching, engaged in conversation with Lord Ashford about bloodlines and breeding programs. The irony was not lost on Eloan. "You mistake me for someone who harbors romantic illusions, Lady Cordelia," she said finally, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "I understand my circumstances quite clearly." "I wonder if you do," Cordelia replied softly. "Because if you did, my dear, you would save yourself considerable pain and withdraw gracefully while you still can." The letter arrived on a silver tray with the morning correspondence, innocuous among the invitations and calling cards that had become routine fixtures of Eloan's elevated circumstances. She recognized her brother's careful handwriting immediately and felt a pang of homesickness so sharp it nearly took her breath away. She had written to Rowan the week before, a carefully crafted explanation of her sudden change in fortune that mentioned the Duke's courtship without dwelling on details that might raise uncomfortable questions. His response, she discovered as she broke the familiar seal, was characteristically direct. "Dearest Eloan," he wrote, "your letter has left me both amazed and deeply concerned. While I cannot deny relief at your improved circumstances, the funds you mention will indeed resolve our most pressing debts. I confess myself troubled by the speed with which this attachment has developed. You have always been the more cautious of us, yet this seems remarkably unlike your usual careful consideration of consequences. I do not mean to question your judgment, but I beg you to remember that men of such elevated position often view relationships with women of our station as temporary entertainments rather than permanent attachments. Guard your heart, sister. I could not bear to see you wounded by expectations that may prove unfounded. Your devoted brother Rowan." The letter trembled in Eloan's hands as she read it a second time, each word a confirmation of truths she had been struggling to ignore. Even Rowan, who knew nothing of the actual arrangement, recognized the fundamental impossibility of what she was pretending to be. A knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She quickly folded the letter and called permission to enter, expecting to see one of the maids with morning chocolate or perhaps Serafina with plans for the day's activities. Instead, Adrian himself stepped into the room, and Eloan felt her pulse quicken with an unwelcome mixture of awareness and resentment. He was impeccably dressed as always, his morning coat fitting his broad shoulders with the precision that only the finest tailors could achieve, but there was something different in his manner, a tension she couldn't quite identify. "Miss Fairchild," he said, his voice carrying its usual measured politeness. "I apologize for the intrusion, but there is a matter we need to discuss." "Of course, Your Grace." She gestured toward the sitting area near the window, but he remained standing, his hands clasped behind his back in a pose she had come to recognize as his preparation for unpleasant conversations. "I received a visit from my grandmother this morning," he began. "She has been observing our association with considerable interest." Eloan's stomach tightened. And she believes our arrangement may be achieving its purpose too well." The careful phrasing didn't disguise the implications. "You mean she suspects the attachment is becoming genuine?" "She means," Adrian said quietly, "that she fears you may be developing feelings that extend beyond our agreement." The words hung between them like an accusation. Eloan felt heat climb her throat, not from embarrassment but from a fury so pure it surprised her with its intensity. "How presumptuous of Her Grace to concern herself with my emotional state," she said, her voice deadly calm. "And how convenient that such concerns should arise just as Lady Cordelia grows impatient with your continued unavailability." Something flickered across Adrian's expression, surprise perhaps, or recognition that his careful control of the situation was beginning to slip. "Miss Fairchild." "No." She stood abruptly, the letter from Rowan still clutched in her hand. "You will listen to me for once, Your Grace. I have played my part in this charade with perfect compliance. I have endured the scrutiny, the whispers, the barely veiled insults from people who consider me beneath their notice. I have smiled and curtsied and pretended to be charmed by your attention while knowing full well that every gesture was calculated, every kindness performed for the benefit of our audience." Adrian had gone very still, his pale eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that might have made her falter under other circumstances. "But what I will not endure," she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word, "is being treated as if I am some pathetic creature who might mistake business for affection, who might be foolish enough to believe that a few quiet conversations and public courtesies indicate genuine regard. Eloan. The use of her given name stopped her momentarily, but only because it was the first time he had spoken it without the barrier of formal address. "I am not a romantic fool, Your Grace," she said more quietly. "I know exactly what I am to you, a temporary convenience, adequate to serve your purposes until you can extricate yourself gracefully and pursue the marriage your station demands. I have always known it. What offends me is your assumption that I might have forgotten." Adrian took a step closer and she saw something in his expression that she couldn't identify, regret, perhaps, or something that might have been pain. "You're right," he said finally. "And I apologize. The fault is not in your understanding of our arrangement, but in my discomfort with how well you have fulfilled your part of it." The admission caught her off guard. "Your discomfort?" He was silent for a long moment, studying her face as if trying to memorize it. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. "I entered this arrangement believing I could control every aspect of it, the duration, the consequences, the emotional limitations. I did not anticipate that you would prove to be so much more than adequate." Eloan felt her breath catch, but she forced herself to remain steady. "More flattery, Your Grace? Or another calculated gesture designed to keep me compliant?" "Neither." His hand moved as if he intended to reach for her, then fell back to his side. "The truth, though I suspect you will find it as unwelcome as I do." "And what truth is that?" "That somewhere between our first conversation in the library and this moment, I have begun to wish our arrangement were genuine. That I have caught myself forgetting it is performance and allowing myself to believe." He stopped, his jaw tightening. "But such wishes are irrelevant. They change nothing about what must ultimately occur." The confession hung between them, more devastating than any cruelty could have been. Because it confirmed what she had begun to suspect in her most unguarded moments, that whatever had developed between them was real, and that reality made it infinitely more tragic. "Then we understand each other perfectly," she said softly. "The arrangement continues until you choose to end it. But please do not insult either of us by pretending that your eventual marriage to Lady Cordelia is anything other than the outcome we have both always expected." The confrontation with Adrian left Eloan feeling as though something fundamental had shifted in the carefully balanced architecture of their arrangement. For 3 days, they moved through their social obligations with the same practiced ease, but beneath the surface, every interaction carried the weight of unspoken truths. She found herself studying him during their public appearances with new eyes, cataloging the small tells that betrayed his internal struggle, the way his hand lingered a fraction too long when he helped her from carriages, the slight tension that appeared around his eyes when other gentlemen paid her particular attention, the careful distance he now maintained during their private moments in the house. It was torture, this new awareness. Before his confession, she had been able to armor herself against the moments when he seemed genuinely caring, dismissing them as skillful performance. Now she recognized them for what they were, genuine impulses ruthlessly suppressed in service of duty and expectation. The realization made everything worse. On Thursday evening, as they prepared to attend Lady Montrose's soirée, Serafina appeared in Eloan's sitting room with a particular expression that indicated she intended to meddle in matters that were none of her concern. "You and Adrian are being ridiculous," she announced without preamble, settling herself in the chair by the window with the decisive air of someone prepared for battle. Eloan paused in her examination of jewelry options, meeting Serafina's gaze in the mirror. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." "Of course you do. You're both walking around like tragic figures in a Gothic novel, all meaningful glances and carefully restrained emotion. It's exhausting to observe and entirely unnecessary. Your brother and I understand our circumstances quite clearly, Serafina. There is nothing tragic in accepting reality." "Reality?" Serafina made a sound that was distinctly unladylike. "Reality is that you're both miserable and pretending otherwise for the sake of propriety and family expectations that haven't changed substantially since the Middle Ages." Eloan turned to face her directly. "And what would you have us do? Defy convention, ignore the obligations of his position, pretend that love conquers all social barriers? We're not characters in one of your romantic novels, Serafina. Some obstacles cannot be overcome through pure determination and good intentions." "Can't they?" Serafina's pale eyes, so like her brother's, held a stubborn light that made Eloan suddenly wary. "Tell me, Eloan, what do you know about our parents' marriage?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. "Very little. Your grandmother mentioned that your mother married beneath her station, but—" "Beneath her station." Serafina laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Is that how she described it?" How diplomatically vague. She rose and moved to the window, looking out over the darkening square with an expression that seemed older than her 20 years. Our mother was Lady Catherine Blackwood, daughter of the Earl of Westbridge. Our father was the second son of a duke, which made him entirely suitable by any reasonable standard. But the dowager, our paternal grandmother, disapproved of the match because she had chosen another bride for Papa, one with better connections and a larger dowry. Eloan felt something cold settle in her stomach. Serafina. The campaign against Mama was subtle but relentless, Serafina continued, her voice carefully controlled. Never direct criticism, nothing that could be challenged openly, but constant small reminders that she wasn't quite what had been expected. Her background was provincial, her dowry modest, her social connections limited compared to what they might have been. She was made to feel perpetually insufficient, always struggling to prove herself worthy of a position she had every right to occupy. Why are you telling me this? Serafina turned back to face her, and Eloan saw tears glittering in her eyes. Because Adrian was 12 when Mama died. Old enough to understand that she had been slowly destroyed by the constant pressure to be someone other than herself, but too young to recognize that the fault lay not with her inadequacies but with people who chose to emphasize them rather than celebrate her qualities. The pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. He blames himself. He blames love, Serafina corrected. He believes that if Papa had chosen duty over affection, if he had married the bride his mother selected, Mama would never have suffered. So Adrian has spent the last 15 years ensuring he will never make the same choice, never allow emotion to override obligation. Eloan sank into her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. And he sees our situation as history repeating itself. Of course he does. You represent everything he has trained himself to resist. Genuine feeling over calculated advantage, authentic connection over strategic alliance. The fact that he cares for you despite every rational argument against it terrifies him more than any external opposition could. But caring isn't enough, is it? Eloan's voice was barely above a whisper. Not when weighed against centuries of tradition and the expectations of everyone who depends on his choices. Isn't it? Serafina leaned forward, her expression intense. Eloan, what if the lesson Adrian learned from our parents' tragedy was the wrong one? What if the problem wasn't that Papa chose love over duty, but that the family chose to punish Mama for not being what they had predetermined she should be? The suggestion hung in the air between them, radical and dangerous and impossibly tempting. Eloan found herself imagining what it would mean, Adrian choosing her not despite his responsibilities but as part of them, creating a different kind of ducal household, one where affection and duty reinforced rather than opposed each other. But such fantasies were luxuries she could not afford. It doesn't matter what lesson he should have learned, she said finally. Only what lesson he did learn. And that lesson has shaped 15 years of careful self-control. I cannot ask him to abandon everything he believes about duty and protection simply because I wish circumstances were different. You're not asking him to abandon anything, Serafina said urgently. You're asking him to consider that love and duty might not be mutually exclusive, that he might serve his responsibilities better by choosing happiness than by sacrificing it. And if I'm wrong? If love proves insufficient to overcome the practical realities of our different stations? If I become another cautionary tale about the dangers of marrying beneath one's position? Serafina was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. Then you will have tried and failed and at least known that the attempt was worthy of the risk. But if you don't try, if you both simply accept that society's expectations are more powerful than your own choices, then you surrender without even fighting. And that, my dear friend, would be the real tragedy. The masquerade ball at the Duke of Pemberton's residence was to be the social event of the season, an elaborate affair where London's elite could indulge in the delicious anonymity of silk masks and assumed identities. For Eloan, it represented both opportunity and torment. A single evening where she might forget the constraints of her position and simply exist as herself, even as she remained painfully aware that it was likely to be one of the last public events she would attend as Adrian's supposed intended. The signs had been accumulating for days. Servants whispered more frequently when she passed. The dowager's pointed questions about her future plans had grown more frequent and less subtle. Most tellingly, Lady Cordelia had begun appearing at events with a particular glow of confidence that suggested knowledge of developments not yet made public. Serafina had outdone herself with Eloan's costume, a gown of deep midnight blue silk that transformed her modest figure into something striking, paired with an elaborate mask of silver and sapphires that concealed the upper half of her face while drawing attention to her mouth and the graceful line of her throat. Looking at herself in the mirror, Eloan barely recognized the elegant figure staring back at her. "You look magnificent," Serafina pronounced with satisfaction, making final adjustments to the mask's ribbons. "Anonymous and magnificent. Tonight, you are not Miss Fairchild the governess or the Duke's controversial choice. You are simply a woman at a ball. If only it were that simple." The ballroom at Pemberton House had been transformed into something from a fairy tale, all midnight blue drapery and silver stars suspended from the ceiling like captured constellations. Guests moved through the space like exotic birds, their elaborate costumes creating a kaleidoscope of color and mystery. In the flickering candlelight, with faces half hidden behind silk and feathers, the usual rigid hierarchy seemed temporarily suspended. Eloan found herself swept into the dancing almost immediately, passed from one masked partner to another in a series of waltzes and country dances that left her breathless and oddly exhilarated. Here, behind her mask, she could be graceful without being judged, witty without being measured against expectations, beautiful without being found wanting. It was during a brief pause to catch her breath that she noticed the figure watching her from across the room. Even masked, even dressed in the elaborate black domino that was the preferred costume of gentlemen who wished to remain completely anonymous, she would have recognized Adrian anywhere. Something about the way he held himself, the careful stillness of his posture, the intensity of attention that seemed to follow her every movement. Their eyes met across the crowded ballroom and Eloan felt her breath catch. In the anonymity of the masquerade, something electric passed between them, recognition, desire, and a dangerous freedom from the constraints that normally governed their interactions. He began moving toward her through the crowd, not quickly but with the measured purpose she had come to associate with his most important decisions. Eloan found herself frozen in place, her heart beating so rapidly she feared it might be visible beneath the silk of her gown. "Miss," he said when he reached her, offering a bow that was perfectly correct and somehow entirely inappropriate given the heat in his eyes behind the black silk mask. "Would you honor me with the next dance?" The request was formal, but his voice carried undercurrents that made her skin prickle with awareness. Here, in this magical space where identities were fluid and expectations suspended, he was not the Duke of Carrington and she was not the inconvenient woman he was supposed to abandon. They were simply two people drawn to each other by forces they had spent weeks trying to deny. "I would be delighted," she replied, placing her gloved hand in his. The dance that followed was unlike anything they had shared during their carefully orchestrated public performances. This waltz carried genuine intimacy, his hand warm against her waist, her fingers curled against his shoulder with an awareness that had nothing to do with propriety and everything to do with the way he looked at her behind his mask. They danced in silence for several measures, the music and movement creating a cocoon of privacy in the midst of the crowded ballroom. When he finally spoke, his voice was pitched for her ears alone. "You're beautiful tonight." The simple words hit her with unexpected force. Not "you look well," or "your appearance is suitable," the careful compliments he offered during their public performances, but something direct and honest that acknowledged her as a woman rather than a role she was playing. "Your Grace." "Adrian," he corrected softly. "Tonight, just Adrian." The name felt dangerous on her tongue, like a word that might change everything simply by being spoken. "Adrian." His hand tightened fractionally at her waist, and she saw something flicker behind his mask that looked like pain and desire intermingled. "I need to tell you something," he said as they turned through the elegant figures of the waltz. "Before it's too late, before I lose the courage that this mask seems to have given me." Eloan's step faltered slightly, but he guided her smoothly back into the rhythm. "What?" "That I have been a coward. That I have allowed fear of consequences that may never occur to blind me to possibilities that exist right now, in this moment." The words washed over her like a tide, dangerous and irresistible. "Adrian, please?" "No." His voice carried quiet determination. "Let me say this while I can still pretend we are strangers meeting for the first time, while I can speak honestly without the weight of duty and expectation crushing every word." He guided her toward the edge of the dance floor, to a shadowed alcove partially concealed by trailing ivy and elaborate floral arrangements. In the relative privacy, he turned to face her directly, his hand still holding hers. "I love you," he said simply. "Not the performance you have given, not the role you have played so admirably, but you. Eloan Fairchild, who reads philosophy in my library and challenges my assumptions about duty and sacrifice. Who bears scrutiny and criticism with dignity while maintaining her own principles. who makes me remember that contentment is not a luxury but a necessary part of being human. The confession hung between them in the flower-scented air, more precious and dangerous than any jewel. Eloan felt tears gathering behind her mask, but whether they were tears of joy or sorrow she couldn't say. "And I love you," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Against all reason and wisdom, despite knowing that such feelings can only lead to heartbreak for both of us. His thumb traced across her knuckles, a gesture so tender it nearly undid her completely. "Then we are both fools," he said. "And perhaps, for tonight at least, that is enough." The spell of the masquerade lasted until dawn, but reality returned with the harsh light of morning and a summons that arrived with Eloan's breakfast tray. The Dowager Duchess of Carrington requested her immediate presence in the blue drawing room, a command disguised as an invitation, delivered with the particular formality that indicated serious business was at hand. Eloan dressed with unusual care, choosing a morning gown of pale gray silk that conveyed respectability without ostentation. Whatever conversation awaited her, she would meet it with dignity and tact, even if her heart felt as fragile as spun glass after the previous evening's revelations. The blue drawing room lived up to its name, all cerulean silk and gilt furnishings that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth and unquestioned authority. The dowager sat enthroned in a chair that might have been designed for receiving supplicants, her silver hair arranged with military precision and her pale eyes, so like Adrian's, holding the particular frost that indicated displeasure. "Miss Fairchild," she said without preamble as Eloan performed her curtsy. "Please sit. We have matters of some delicacy to discuss." Eloan took the indicated chair, folding her hands in her lap and meeting the older woman's gaze with what she hoped was appropriate composure. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the furniture understood the gravity of whatever was about to unfold. "I believe," the dowager continued, "that you are an intelligent young woman who understands the realities of your situation, the temporary nature of your association with my grandson. I have always understood the terms of our arrangement, Your Grace." "Have you?" The dowager's expression suggested skepticism. "Because my observations over the past weeks indicate a level of familiarity that extends beyond what such an arrangement should properly entail." Heat climbed Eloan's throat, but she kept her voice steady. "If your grace has concerns about my conduct—" "My concerns, Miss Fairchild, are not about your conduct, which has been exemplary, but about the consequences of prolonging this charade beyond its useful purpose." The words settled in the air between them like a blade finding its target. Eloan felt something cold spread through her chest as the implications became clear. The useful purpose being? Lady Cordelia's family has grown sufficiently anxious about Adrian's intentions to make their willingness to negotiate quite clear. Her father called upon me yesterday to discuss settlement terms and wedding arrangements. The strategy has succeeded admirably. "I see." Eloan's voice sounded distant to her own ears. "And my role in this success is now concluded." "Not concluded precisely, but requiring a modification." The dowager rose and moved to the window, her silk skirts rustling with the authority of someone accustomed to orchestrating other people's fates. "You see, Miss Fairchild, there is one final service you can provide that would ensure the smooth resolution of this entire affair." Eloan waited, though every instinct warned her that whatever was coming would require more courage than she might possess. "Adrian must be the one to end your engagement," the dowager continued, her back still turned to the room. "A gentleman's decision to withdraw from an unsuitable attachment before proposing to an appropriate bride is socially acceptable, even admirable. It demonstrates maturity and proper consideration of duty. Whereas a woman who withdraws first appears grasping and mercenary." "Precisely." The dowager turned back to face her, approval flickering in her cold eyes. "You do understand the subtleties involved. However, Adrian's natural consideration for your feelings may make such a decision difficult for him to execute in a timely manner." Eloan felt the trap closing around her with the precision of clockwork. "And you believe I can influence his decision?" "I believe you can make it easier for him by providing clear evidence that continuing the association would be inadvisable for all concerned." The euphemisms were delicately chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable. The dowager wanted Eloan to engineer her own social destruction, to create a scandal or impropriety that would force Adrian to distance himself while preserving his reputation and clearing the path for his marriage to Lady Cordelia. "What sort of evidence did your grace have in mind?" "Nothing dramatic or permanently damaging to your character, of course. Perhaps an inappropriate conversation overheard by the right ears." A moment of familiarity witnessed by someone whose discretion cannot be guaranteed. The appearance of attachment that exceeds proper bounds. Eloan stared at the woman who was calmly proposing the destruction of her social standing with the same tone she might use to discuss menu planning. The elegant cruelty of it took her breath away. And if I refuse? The dowager's smile held no warmth whatsoever. Then I fear Adrian's natural kindness may prolong this situation indefinitely, to the detriment of his duty and your own future prospects. Surely you don't wish to be responsible for preventing him from fulfilling his obligations to the dukedom? The guilt was expertly applied, leveraging Eloan's genuine care for Adrian against her own interests. But beneath the manipulation she heard something else, a note of genuine concern, perhaps even desperation. You're afraid, Eloan realized suddenly. You're afraid he might actually choose me. The dowager's composure slipped fractionally, revealing something harder and more desperate beneath the aristocratic control. Adrian is his father's son, she said quietly. Capable of great foolishness in service of romantic ideals. I will not watch him destroy himself for the sake of an attachment that can bring nothing but misery to all concerned. Or you will not allow him to choose happiness over the alliance you have planned for him since childhood. Happiness. The word dripped with disdain. A luxury that men in Adrian's position cannot afford, as his father learned to his eternal regret. I will not see my grandson repeat those mistakes. The conversation had stripped away all pretense, revealing the fundamental battle of wills beneath the polite negotiations. Eloan found herself standing at a crossroads that would determine not only her own fate but Adrian's as well. She could comply with the dowager's request, sacrifice herself to preserve Adrian's position and future. Or she could refuse, force a confrontation that might destroy them both but at least preserve the possibility of genuine choice. I need time to consider your proposal, Your Grace. Time is a luxury we no longer possess, Miss Fairchild. Lady Cordelia's patience has limits, and social calendars wait for no one's convenience. I require your answer by tomorrow morning. Eloan rose from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. Then you shall have it. As she walked toward the door, the dowager's voice followed her with a note of what might have been genuine regret. For what it's worth, Miss Fairchild, I do not doubt your feelings for Adrian, nor his for you. But some barriers cannot be overcome through sheer determination, no matter how pure the motivation. Sometimes wisdom lies in accepting limitations rather than fighting them. Eloan paused at the threshold, her hand on the door handle. The spell of the masquerade lasted until dawn, but reality returned with the harsh light of morning and a summons that arrived with Eloan's breakfast tray. The Dowager Duchess of Carrington requested her immediate presence in the blue drawing room, a command disguised as an invitation, delivered with the particular formality that indicated serious business was at hand. Eloan dressed with unusual care, choosing a morning gown of pale gray silk that conveyed respectability without ostentation. Whatever conversation awaited her, she would meet it with dignity and tact, even if her heart felt as fragile as spun glass after the previous evening's revelations. The blue drawing room lived up to its name, all cerulean silk and gilt furnishings that spoke of generations of accumulated wealth and unquestioned authority. The dowager sat enthroned in a chair that might have been designed for receiving supplicants, her silver hair arranged with military precision and her pale eyes, so like Adrian's, holding the particular frost that indicated displeasure. Miss Fairchild, she said without preamble as Eloan performed her curtsy. Please sit. We have matters of some delicacy to discuss. Eloan took the indicated chair, folding her hands in her lap and meeting the older woman's gaze with what she hoped was appropriate composure. Around them, the room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the furniture understood the gravity of whatever was about to unfold. I believe, the dowager continued, that you are an intelligent young woman who understands the realities of your situation, the temporary nature of your association with my grandson. I have always understood the terms of our arrangement, Your Grace. Have you? The dowager's expression suggested skepticism. Because my observations over the past weeks indicate a level of familiarity that extends beyond what such an arrangement should properly entail. Heat climbed Eloan's throat, but she kept her voice steady. If Your Grace has concerns about my conduct. My concerns, Miss Fairchild, are not about your conduct, which has been exemplary, but about the consequences of prolonging this charade beyond its useful purpose. The words settled in the air between them like a blade finding its target. Eloan felt something cold spread through her chest as the implications became clear. The useful purpose being? Lady Cordelia's family has grown sufficiently anxious about Adrian's intentions to make their willingness to negotiate quite clear. Her father called upon me yesterday to discuss settlement terms and wedding arrangements. The strategy has succeeded admirably. I see. Eloan's voice sounded distant to her own ears. And my role in this success is now concluded. Not concluded precisely, but requiring a modification. The dowager rose and moved to the window, her silk skirts rustling with the authority of someone accustomed to orchestrating other people's fates. You see, Miss Fairchild, there is one final service you can provide that would ensure the smooth resolution of this entire affair. Eloan waited, though every instinct warned her that whatever was coming would require more courage than she might possess. Adrian must be the one to end your engagement, the dowager continued, her back still turned to the room. A gentleman's decision to withdraw from an unsuitable attachment before proposing to an appropriate bride is socially acceptable, even admirable. It demonstrates maturity and proper consideration of duty. Whereas a woman who withdraws first appears grasping and mercenary. Precisely. The dowager turned back to face her, approval flickering in her cold eyes. You do understand the subtleties involved. However, Adrian's natural consideration for your feelings may make such a decision difficult for him to execute in a timely manner. Eloan felt the trap closing around her with the precision of clockwork. And you believe I can influence his decision. I believe you can make it easier for him by providing clear evidence that continuing the association would be inadvisable for all concerned. The euphemisms were delicately chosen, but their meaning was unmistakable. The dowager wanted Eloan to engineer her own social destruction, to create a scandal or impropriety that would force Adrian to distance himself while preserving his reputation and clearing the path for his marriage to Lady Cordelia. What sort of evidence did your grace have in mind? Nothing dramatic or permanently damaging to your character, of course. Perhaps an inappropriate conversation overheard by the right ears. A moment of familiarity witnessed by someone whose discretion cannot be guaranteed. The appearance of attachment that exceeds proper bounds. Eloan stared at the woman who was calmly proposing the destruction of her social standing with the same tone she might use to discuss menu planning. The elegant cruelty of it took her breath away. And if I refuse? The dowager's smile held no warmth whatsoever. Then I fear Adrian's natural kindness may prolong this situation indefinitely, to the detriment of his duty and your own future prospects. Surely you don't wish to be responsible for preventing him from fulfilling his obligations to the dukedom? The guilt was expertly applied, leveraging Eloan's genuine care for Adrian against her own interests. But beneath the manipulation she heard something else, a note of genuine concern, perhaps even desperation. You're afraid, Eloan realized suddenly. You're afraid he might actually choose me. The dowager's composure slipped fractionally, revealing something harder and more desperate beneath the aristocratic control. Adrian is his father's son, she said quietly, capable of great foolishness in service of romantic ideals. I will not watch him destroy himself for the sake of an attachment that can bring nothing but misery to all concerned. Or you will not allow him to choose happiness over the alliance you have planned for him since childhood. Happiness. The word dripped with disdain. A luxury that men in Adrian's position cannot afford, as his father learned to his eternal regret. I will not see my grandson repeat those mistakes. The conversation had stripped away all pretense, revealing the fundamental battle of wills beneath the polite negotiations. Eloan found herself standing at a crossroads that would determine not only her own fate but Adrian's as well. She could comply with the dowager's request, sacrifice herself to preserve Adrian's position and future. Or she could refuse, force a confrontation that might destroy them both but at least preserve the possibility of genuine choice. I need time to consider your proposal, Your Grace. Time is a luxury we no longer possess, Miss Fairchild. Lady Cordelia's patience has limits, and social calendars wait for no one's convenience. I require your answer by tomorrow morning. Eloan rose from her chair with as much dignity as she could muster. Then you shall have it. As she walked toward the door, the dowager's voice followed her with a note of what might have been genuine regret. For what it's worth, Miss Fairchild, I do not doubt your feelings for Adrian, nor his for you. But some barriers cannot be overcome through sheer determination, no matter how pure the motivation. Sometimes wisdom lies in accepting limitations rather than fighting them. Eloan paused at the threshold, her hand on the door handle. And sometimes, Your Grace, wisdom lies in recognizing that the limitations we accept are often those we have imposed upon ourselves. Eloan found Adrian in the conservatory among his mother's orchids, sunlight catching his dark hair as he studied the exotic blooms with careful attention. She watched him silently, memorizing this moment before announcing her presence. Adrian. He turned and she saw he'd been expecting her. His expression held resignation mixed with determination. He too had received a visit from his grandmother. Eloan, I wondered when you would come. She spoke to you as well. This morning. Shortly after you, I imagine. His jaw tightened. Her timing is always exceptional. They faced each other in the green-tinged light, surrounded by beauty and the weight of decisions that would reshape their lives. She wants me to engineer my own downfall, Eloan said quietly. Create some impropriety that would force you to distance yourself while preserving your reputation. I know. Adrian's voice carried controlled fury. I told her I would not allow you to sacrifice yourself for my family's social convenience. If our association ends, it will be by my choice, not through manipulation of your reputation. The words brought no relief. She could see the cost of such defiance, duty warring with genuine feeling. And then what? She asked softly. You marry me out of principle and spend your life watching me struggle to meet expectations I can never fulfill? Watching yourself become the subject of whispers about the Duke who threw away his heritage for a governess. You belong wherever you choose to be, he said fiercely. Character matters more than breeding. Perhaps. But the world doesn't share that perspective. She touched his face, feeling the slight roughness of his shave. I've been thinking about your mother. He stilled but didn't pull away. Serafina told me the real story. How she was destroyed not by inadequacies but by people who chose to emphasize them rather than celebrate her strengths. Which is exactly what would happen to you, Adrian said rawly. And I'd be powerless to protect you. What if your family learned the wrong lesson? What if the problem wasn't that your father chose love over duty, but that the family refused to support the marriage once it occurred? His hands covered hers, pressing her palm to his cheek. Even if true, it changes nothing. My grandmother's opposition, society's expectations. None of that disappears because we wish it would. No. But we could face those challenges together rather than surrendering without trying. Hope flickered in his eyes, bright and desperate, before the familiar mask of control returned. And if we failed? If I proved as unable to protect you as my father was my mother? Could you forgive me for believing love might be enough? Could you forgive yourself for not trying? For choosing safety over something extraordinary? They stood balanced between possibility and resignation, surrounded by his mother's impossible blooms, beauty flourishing despite unfavorable conditions. There's something else, Adrian said finally, voice barely audible. Something my grandmother doesn't know. I've been making arrangements, transferring properties, restructuring obligations to create flexibility. What kind of flexibility? The kind that would let me step away from the dukedom if necessary. Choose love over duty without destroying those who depend on the estate. The revelation stunned her. Adrian, you can't. I can't. The title would pass to my cousin William. Financial obligations would be met, dependents protected. And we would be free. Free, she whispered. Ordinary. A gentleman of modest means and his wife, building whatever life we chose without centuries of expectation crushing every decision. It's too much. I cannot ask. You're not asking. I'm choosing. For the first time, I'm choosing what I want rather than what I should want. He pulled her closer. But I need to know you would choose it too. That a life without titles or grand houses would be enough if it meant we could have each other. Eloan looked into his face, seeing past aristocratic perfection to the uncertain, hopeful man beneath, finally brave enough to act on love despite every argument against it. Yes, she said simply. It would be everything. The decision, once made, required careful orchestration. Adrian's plan was audacious in its simplicity. He would formally renounce his claim to the dukedom in favor of his cousin, retain enough property to ensure their modest comfort, and marry Eloan as a private gentleman rather than a duke. But such a radical departure from duty required delicate handling to minimize scandal and protect those who would be affected by his choice. The first step was a private conversation with William Ashbourne, the cousin who would inherit the title. Adrian had written requesting an immediate meeting, and William arrived from his estate in Yorkshire within 2 days, his expression grave as he was shown into the library where Adrian waited. Cousin, William said simply, settling into the chair across from Adrian's desk. Your letter was unexpected. William was a steady man of 35, with the same pale eyes as the Ashbourne line but a more solid, practical bearing. He had managed his own estates with competence and married a sensible woman who had given him 3 children and no social ambitions beyond their modest sphere. I imagine it was, Adrian replied. But I believe you understand the gravity of what I'm proposing. You wish to abdicate in my favor so that you can marry your governess. William's tone held no judgment, merely an assessment of facts. The financial arrangements you've outlined would indeed preserve the estate's stability, and I confess myself capable of assuming the responsibilities. But have you considered the broader implications? You mean the scandal? Among other things. William leaned forward, his expression serious. Adrian, I've known you since we were children. I've watched you sacrifice personal desires to duty your entire adult life. If you've reached the point of considering such a drastic step, I assume your feelings are genuine and profound. They are. Then I will support your decision whatever the consequences. William's voice carried quiet conviction. But you must understand, once you renounce the title there will be no returning. Society may eventually forgive a duke who makes an unsuitable marriage, but they will never forgive a man who abandons his birthright entirely. I understand. And Miss Fairchild? Does she comprehend what she would be gaining and losing? The security of your protection, but also the burden of being responsible for your choice. Adrian was quiet for a moment, remembering Eloan's face when he had described his plan, the mixture of hope and terror, love and guilt warring in her dark eyes. She understands. Perhaps better than I do. William nodded slowly. Then we proceed. I'll need time to arrange my own affairs, settle my family at Ashford Hall. 2 months, perhaps 3. And our grandmother's reaction? Will be volcanic, William said dryly. But she's survived worse shocks. She'll adapt, eventually, because the alternative is losing you entirely. That evening, Adrian found himself in the unusual position of requesting a private audience with his grandmother rather than being summoned to one. He found her in her private sitting room, working on correspondence with the mechanical precision she brought to all administrative tasks. Adrian. She looked up as he entered, her pale eyes immediately alert to his mood. You have the look of a man who has made an irreversible decision. I have. She set down her pen and folded her hands, preparing herself for whatever blow was coming. Despite their frequent conflicts, Adrian felt a pang of genuine affection for the woman who had shaped so much of his character, even as he prepared to defy her most fundamental expectations. I am going to renounce my claim to the dukedom, he said without preamble. William has agreed to assume the title and responsibilities. The transition will be managed carefully to minimize disruption to the estate and dependents. For perhaps the first time in his memory, the dowager was struck completely speechless. She stared at him as if he had announced his intention to sprout wings and fly to the moon. You cannot be serious. I am entirely serious. The arrangements are already in motion. For that governess? Her voice rose with incredulous fury. You would throw away centuries of heritage, abandon everything your ancestors built, betray every sacrifice made in service of this family's honor, for a woman whose greatest accomplishment is knowing which fork to use at dinner? For a woman whose intelligence, strength, and integrity make her worthy of any man's devotion, Adrian replied calmly. Including mine. The dowager rose from her chair, pacing to the window with agitated energy that reminded him powerfully of his own habits when distressed. This is madness, Adrian. Romantic madness that will destroy you both. Do you think love will sustain you when you're reduced to living in some modest cottage, counting pennies and watching your children grow up as ordinary citizens rather than inheritors of a great legacy? I think love will sustain me better than duty without affection has sustained you, he said quietly. The words struck home with more force than he had intended. The dowager's face went very pale, and for a moment she looked every one of her 70 years. That, she said softly, was unnecessarily cruel. But not untrue. Adrian moved closer, his voice gentling. Grandmother, I know you believe you're protecting me from repeating my father's mistakes. But what if his mistake was not marrying for love, but allowing that love to be slowly poisoned by people who refuse to accept it? Your father's love killed your mother as surely as any disease. My father's love gave my mother the happiest years of her life. It was the constant pressure to prove herself worthy that destroyed her, the endless message that she wasn't enough, could never be enough. Adrian's voice carried quiet conviction. I will not subject Eloan to that. If necessary, I will remove us both from the circumstances that would make such pressure possible. The dowager was silent for a long moment, staring out at the garden where her daughter-in-law had once walked with such hope for the future. And if I refuse to accept this decision? If I cut you off entirely, disinherit you completely? Then you will lose a grandson you claim to love in order to preserve a legacy that will continue quite well without my participation. William is not you. No. He's better suited to the role than I ever was. He actually wants it. The truth of that observation hung in the air between them. The dowager turned back to face him, and Adrian saw something in her expression he had never seen before: defeat mixed with a grudging respect. "You are your father's son," she said finally. "Stubborn and romantic and utterly convinced that personal happiness matters more than duty." "I am also your grandson," Adrian replied. "Practical enough to ensure that my personal happiness doesn't come at the expense of everyone who depends on this family's stability." She studied his face for a long moment, searching for some sign of uncertainty or doubt that might give her leverage to change his mind. Finding none, she sank back into her chair with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "When?" "The formal renunciation will take place in 3 months. The marriage will follow immediately after." "And until then?" "Until then, nothing changes publicly. Miss Fairchild will continue in her current role, our engagement will proceed as planned, and the transition arrangements will be handled discreetly." The dowager nodded slowly, already beginning to calculate the social and practical implications of his decision. "I suppose," she said dryly, "I should be grateful that you're handling this with some semblance of responsibility rather than simply eloping to Gretna Green like a pair of impetuous children. I learned the importance of careful planning from you. Among other things." She looked at him with an expression that was part exasperation, part resignation, and perhaps a small part pride. "I don't approve of your choice, Adrian. I think you're making a terrible mistake that will have consequences you can't anticipate. But I also know that nothing I say will change your mind." "No, it won't." "Then I suppose we must all learn to live with the results of your romantic idealism." She picked up her pen again, her voice carefully neutral. "I trust Miss Fairchild understands the magnitude of what you're sacrificing for her sake. She understands that I'm not sacrificing anything that matters compared to what I'm gaining." The dowager's mouth tightened, but she didn't argue further. They both knew the fundamental divide between them could not be bridged with words. She would always see duty as paramount, and he had finally chosen to prioritize love. "Very well," she said quietly. "Then I suppose I should begin preparing to welcome my new granddaughter-in-law. Though I make no promises about the warmth of that welcome. I ask only for courtesy. You shall have it." "But Adrian," she looked up at him one final time, her pale eyes holding a mixture of affection and regret. "If this ends badly, if your romantic gamble destroys both of you, don't expect me to pretend I didn't warn you. I wouldn't dream of it." 3 months later, on a crisp morning in early spring, Eloan Fairchild became Mrs. Adrian Ashbourne in a simple ceremony at the village church near William's estate in Yorkshire. The guest list was deliberately small: Seraphina and William's family, a handful of close friends who had remained loyal despite the scandal, and surprisingly the Dowager Duchess, who arrived with stiff dignity and a wedding gift that spoke more eloquently than words of her grudging acceptance. The bride wore a gown of ivory silk, elegant in its simplicity, with her grandmother's pearls, her only inheritance, gleaming softly at her throat. The groom, no longer bearing the weight of a dukedom on his shoulders, smiled with genuine joy as he spoke his vows in a voice steady with conviction. "I, Adrian, take you, Eloan, to be my wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until we are parted by death." When it came her turn, Eloan's voice rang clear in the small church, carrying across the assembled witnesses with quiet strength. "I, Eloan, take you, Adrian, to be my husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until we are parted by death." The words were traditional, but their meaning had been earned through weeks of difficult choices and moments when love had been tested against duty, expectation, and fear. As Adrian slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, Eloan felt the weight of their shared decision settle around them, not as a burden, but as a foundation upon which they could build whatever life they chose. The wedding breakfast was held at the manor house William now called home, a warm and comfortable residence that reflected his practical nature and his wife's talent for creating spaces where people felt genuinely welcome. The conversation flowed easily, helped by champagne and the relief that came from having navigated the worst of the social storm that had followed Adrian's renunciation. "To new beginnings," William proposed, raising his glass as the small party gathered for the traditional toasts. "And to the courage required to choose love over convention." "To family," Seraphina added, her eyes bright with tears she refused to shed, in all its unexpected forms. The dowager remained largely silent throughout the festivities, but as the afternoon wore on, Eloan noticed her watching the proceedings with something that might have been satisfaction. When the time came for farewells, she approached the new bride with characteristic directness. Mrs. Ashbourne, she said formally, the title carrying both acknowledgement and challenge. I trust you understand the responsibility you've assumed. I do, Your Grace. See that you prove worthy of the sacrifices made on your behalf. The older woman's voice was stern, but her pale eyes held a grudging respect. And see that you make him happy. If you succeed in that, you will have my gratitude whatever our other differences. I intend to spend the rest of my life trying to deserve his choice, Eloan replied quietly. The dowager studied her for a long moment, then nodded with what might have been approval. Perhaps, she said, you already do. As evening approached, Adrian and Eloan departed for Rosewood Cottage, the modest estate that would be their new home. It was a far cry from the grandeur of Carrington House, a Georgian manor with comfortable rooms, a small but well-tended garden, and the kind of peace that came from privacy and genuine contentment. Standing in the drawing room of their new home, surrounded by wedding gifts and the few possessions they had chosen to bring from their former lives, Eloan felt a profound sense of arrival. Not merely at a new residence, but at a life she had never dared to imagine possible. Do you miss it? She asked as Adrian joined her at the window overlooking the garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. The title, the responsibilities, the grand houses and constant attention? He was quiet for a moment, considering her question with the thoughtfulness she had come to love as much as his passion and his principles. I miss the certainty, he said finally. The clear knowledge of what was expected, what role I was meant to play. But I don't miss the weight of living someone else's definition of duty. And now I have the opportunity to define duty for myself. To my wife, to whatever children we might have, to the community where we've chosen to make our home. It's different but not lesser. Eloan turned to face him fully, seeing in his expression the same contentment she felt settling in her own heart. No regrets. Only one, Adrian replied, his smile carrying the warmth that had first captured her attention months ago in his library. That it took me so long to understand that love and duty don't have to be enemies. And now that you understand? Now, he said, drawing her into his arms with the easy confidence of a man who had finally found his proper place in the world, I intend to spend every day proving that the best traditions are the ones we create ourselves. The kiss that followed was witnessed only by the spring flowers nodding in the evening breeze, and it tasted of promises kept and new beginnings embraced with courage and joy. 6 months later, Serafina would write to a friend that her brother and his wife had achieved something remarkable. They had created a life that was both ordinary and extraordinary, filled with the kind of quiet happiness that needed no audience and feared no judgment. Their home had become a gathering place for those who valued intelligence over breeding, kindness over convention, and genuine affection over strategic alliance. The scandal that had once threatened to destroy them both had faded into memory, replaced by the simple truth that love, when chosen deliberately and sustained with mutual respect, could indeed prove stronger than social expectation. They had not conquered society's prejudices, but they had rendered them irrelevant by building something better in their place. And in the end, that was perhaps the greatest triumph of all, not the dramatic victory of romantic idealism over practical constraint, but the quiet success of two people who had chosen each other completely and built a life worthy of that choice, one ordinary, extraordinary day at a time.